Okay, Burnsville Psych, we're going to start Unit 2 today. We're getting into the new unit on the brain and states of consciousness. We're really going to be focusing on the first half of this unit on the brain piece. We're trying to be a little more specific about how we do what we do. So the big question that we're going to be trying to deal with as we go for the next week or so is, what role does the brain play in human behavior and mental processes? Think back to our definition of psychology, we're talking about the systematic study of human behavior and mental processes. So when we're trying to identify, the role that the brain plays, when we're looking at how the nervous system um, functions and how that influences our behavior and mental processes, we are really using kind of a new lens to look at the study of psychology. That kind of we talked about the biological lens early on. That's the focus we're going to be having now. When we look at the nervous system and break it down into parts, we can start this study. And so the first thing that we're going to notice is that if we're following our flow chart here, the nervous system is broken down into central and peripheral. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to figure out that when we're talking about central, we are talking about the middle part of your body. So it's not only your brain, but your spinal cord. Okay? The part of your nervous system that's in the center. When we see the word peripheral, if we connect to what we already know, peripheral vision is the vision out the sides of your eyes. So the peripheral nervous system then would be all of this yellow that branches off of your brain and spinal cord. So when you are taking in information in your body, and it eventually funnels its way to your spinal cord, up your spinal cord, into the central nervous system, and into your brain, that's the information that's coming off of your peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system also broken down into autonomic and somatic. Somatic says the voluntary movements of skeletal muscles. Voluntary movement. So when I purposefully move my body, I'm using the somatic part of my peripheral nervous system. When we're talking about autonomic, we are talking about, I always think of automatic. It says the self-regulated action of internal organs and glands. So a lot of the things that happen without me doing anything. My heart beats by itself. Breathing is happening. There's all kinds of stuff happening in my body, in my internal organs that are kind of keeping me alive that I don't really have to consciously think about. That would be all of the autonomic parts of your nervous system. Okay. When we look at the autonomic part of your peripheral nervous system, we can then talk about these other two ideas, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And to be completely honest, this is one of those places where trying to remember the difference between the two is going to be just a memory trick away. Okay, so sympathetic, when we're talking about the sympathetic part of your autonomic peripheral nervous system, we are talking about turning everything on, using up energy. Psychologists would use the word arousing, meaning your heart rate is going faster, your breathing is moving faster, certain kinds of things are turning on and firing up. When we're talking about the opposite of that, we're talking about parasympathetic. So we're calming everything down, trying to slow things down, trying to quiet your breathing. When we look at this chart, it helps us understand the kinds of things that happen on either side. And frankly, the best example is if I'm in the woods and I see a large bear and I turn and that bear is looking at me and it's growling at me and giving me the look like, I'm going to be dinner. What's likely to happen is my sympathetic nervous system is going to kick on and get me ready to either run away or fight the bear. Psychologists use the term fight or flight to explain how this works. Um, what happens when the sympathetic nervous system kicks on is your pupils dilate so you can take in light, so you can see what's in your environment, where the predators are. Your heartbeat speeds up so you can get more blood pumping to your muscles so that you can run or fight. Your stomach stops digesting whatever is in the stomach because you want that energy to be in your muscles or somewhere else. You can kind of go on down the list. Generally, your breathing will speed up a little bit. Sorry about that strange interruption. So the opposite of that is kind of a situation where you are in a place where you don't want all of those things happening. You don't want your respirations to increase. You don't want your heartbeat racing. You don't want all that nervous energy because you're trying to focus. And so you're trying to get the parasympathetic system to kick on and to slow everything down. Now, the way to do that, if you've ever tried using focused breathing or visualization or meditation or any of those kinds of things, what you're doing is helping your body slow itself down. You can literally slow your heartbeat, slow down your respirations, and turn off all of this crazy arousing stuff uh, by taking a few minutes to just take a breath, slow down, relax, and you can calm your body down. So one useful suggestion out of what we're talking about today, if this sympathetic system kicks in and you don't want it, sometimes you need that kind of energy, but sometimes you don't want it. If you're giving a speech and you feel that happening, a little bit of breathing, and you can actually turn your parasympathetic system on. Just kind of an interesting little piece of information. The next piece we're going to be looking at is neurons and how neurons work. Neurons are the smallest kind of pieces of communication cells that we have in our bodies. This is how information travels from your brain to the rest of your body through that peripheral nervous system. We are going to talk about not only how neurons communicate and how they work, but also the different parts, the structure of the neuron itself. So, if you were good in biology, if you took anatomy, this should be review for the rest of us that find this new material. There's going to be a little bit of new stuff that you're going to have to remember, and we're going to try to make it as painless as possible. Neuron comes from a Greek word that means string, and the reason that makes sense, if you know how neurons work, is that neurons are strung together kind of like a paperclip chain. So when something happens to me and I need to react to it, basically there's information traveling from my brain down to the muscles in my body, telling them to move, and vice versa. We will talk about the process, and the word that's on here is electrochemical process. We're going to talk about how that works today and try to get to the bottom of what that actually means. But neurons are all over your body. This picture shows you different kinds of neurons depending on the specific neurons that we're talking about in your body, but there's lots of different types depending on the function that they have. We're going to kind of do this from a very basic level and work our way from there. First thing you're going to notice on here are these branches up at the top of the screen, and the word dendrite comes from another Greek word that means tree. Dendra means tree. Dendrites receive information. We're going to talk about the kinds of information that they receive, but if you remember back to some biology, they receive the neurotransmitters from a neighboring neuron when we talk about these chains. Dendrites receive information. The information then travels down the dendrite into this part in the middle, which is called the cell body. That's this right here. That black dot would be the nucleus of the cell body. So we're going to say that the cell body contains the nucleus and basically is in charge of keeping the cell alive. That's kind of what the cell body does. So the information comes down the dendrite into the cell body, and then from there, the information will shoot down this long string right here. That long string is called the axon, and surprisingly or not, the axon transmits information. Okay, and we'll talk about the information in a second. Sometimes on certain neurons, you will find them covered in fatty stuff that acts like insulation, and that's what I'm trying to draw. This is a terrible drawing, but this is drawing with a mouse. Fatty insulation, and that insulation is called myelin sheath. Why did I just do that? Myelin sheath. And what it does, the more myelin sheath you have, the more insulation you have on your axon, the faster the information can travel. So think about this. If I am in a situation where um, let's say I feel something hot and it's burning on my skin and I want to pull my arm away from whatever the heat is, the quicker this information can travel, the better. Because remember, information has to travel from the receptors in my skin all the way up my arm into my spinal cord. Remember the nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So then it gets into my spinal cord and up into my brain, and then there's part of my brain that says, hey, that's hot, you should move your arm. And so then that information has to travel back down to the muscles that control my arm, that can pull my arm away from the heat. That whole process, if it took too much time, would result in pain. So the quicker and the faster that information can travel, the better. Axon terminals, where's my pen? I'll make them green, are these little kind of nubs down at the bottom of the axon. Okay, the axon terminals contain the neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters, oops, I didn't spell that right. Let's do that again, neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. So what happens is the information travels down the dendrite to the cell body all the way down the axon, and then it hits the axon terminals. If there's enough of an impulse there, then these little neurotransmitters, these little chemical messengers will spill out into something called the synapse. The synapse is the gap between the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron. So remember we said they were in strings. So if you look at this picture right here, let's make it bigger. Get this one out of the way. What we're seeing is two neurons strung together, and in between them, if you look closely, they're not really touching. There's actually a little space between the two. So what happens then is that the information travels all the way down the axon to these axon terminals, and then the neurotransmitters jump into that space and will bind to the receptors of the neighboring dendrite. So here's a real up-close version of the synapse. Here's the space right in between. This is an axon terminal. This is a dendrite. So the information travels down to the axon terminal, and then if there's enough of an impulse there, those neurotransmitters will spill out into the synapse and then bind to these receptors on the dendrite. That is basically how neurons communicate. What happens then is we're back at the dendrite. And if that'll travel down to the cell body, all the way down the axon to the next neuron, and it keeps going all the way down the string. So when we're talking about that example that I gave, where we had a situation where I needed information to travel from, let's say, my hand to my brain, it's going neuron by neuron all the way up and down that string. So you think about how many neurons are going to be in that chain, there's a lot of them. So the quicker this information will move, the better. Now, last thing we said was that this was a neurochemical process. Sorry, we said electrochemical process. The chemical part is the neurotransmitters. So when they spill out to the synapse and bind to the neighboring dendrites, that's the chemical piece. Everything in between is electrical. So there's an electrical pulse that travels down the dendrite into the cell body, all the way down the axon. And if there's enough of an electrical pulse when it hits that next neurotransmitter, sorry, the next axon terminal, then we have another burst of chemical messengers that spill out into the synapse, receive on the following dendrite, and then it becomes electrical again. That's where the electrical and chemical piece ends up. This is the beginning part of our discussion of neurons. Lots of information here. You should be reading chapter 6, and when we get to class, we will do, for sure, a healthy review of this material. Hopefully you got something out of it. Good luck. We'll see you tomorrow.